This is the Q&A session. This is a new thing we're trying this year. Rather than have questions in between talks, we want to see how it would work if we saved them up for a concentrated session where we can really dig into the issues without the hassles of the next person coming on stage and feeling rushed. How do you ask a question? Well, the URL is right there. You can go to gophercon.com/questions and just type your question in there, or upvote one that's already ready on the list. So I will be your moderator and somehow manage the duality of being both a speaker and a moderator. We'll see how that goes. So I would like to bring on stage our speakers from this morning. We have Francesc Campoy, Alan Donovan, Daniel Watnick, Wisdom Ameda, and Ivan. Ivan, how do I say? Ivan Danilov.
Just gonna see it somewhere. Oh, what? Yeah. Wow, that is intense.
Okay, so we're here till 4:20. So I want to open with a question from the audience. It says, you're all great engineers, so probably you bring your own secret sauce when coding. In as few words as possible, what is your secret sauce? Lead off.
What was the question?
What do you think is your superpower, your secret sauce when coding? Like, what makes you such great engineers? Yeah, Daniel?
I think, I don't know if this is a secret sauce, but I think humility for me is a big one, because I think where I learn most and improve my code most is in code reviews and in interacting with other engineers. So I think, having the mindset that questions are good and failing can be good and asking questions is good is a big part of my learning.
Yeah, anybody else want to contribute?
Getting to work with the Go team helps a lot.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, being surrounded by amazing people that know way more than you and that are nice and willing to answer any question or tell you why you're wrong on things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I second that. That I don't like actually the word like brilliant developer, because we right now working mostly on teams, and being a great developer means that you are great on team, that you can collaborate with your coworkers, and yeah, so this question should be asked in the context of being inside the team. So if you're good with your coworkers, if you work well with people and you can talk and listen and learn, then you will be the great developer.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is to Alan, and it's relating to integration between the different integrations for the Guru. So how does the Go Guru feature completeness compare in Sublime versus Visual Code versus Atom, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a good question. So the Emacs is the editor I use, and therefore it tends to get the first attention, although I have to thank Dominic Honeff, because he wrote a lot of the Emacs Lisp logic. Almost all the features work equally across them, because there's really not much logic specific to a particular editor. But the highlighting and the support for modified buffers and jump to definition each requires a little bit of logic. I think only modified buffers is not supported across the board.
Okay. There's a question, I guess, for Wisdom about vendoring. Should we check in our vendor directory?
Yes.
We're going to get through these so quickly. As a follow-up, have you seen examples where one wouldn't check in the vendor directory?
So the way I think about it, part of the reason you have vendoring in Go and why you don't want to check it in is because you can manage the exact version of the dependencies that your application depends on, right? So if you don't have it checked in, it kind of defeats the purpose of having it vendored in the first place. Because otherwise, when you need to build your project, you'd have to go get and then go build each time. I imagine perhaps there are circumstances when you perhaps wouldn't want to do this. I can't think of any that I'm convinced is good, but I don't know. Yeah. I strongly suggest you always check in your third-party dependencies.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So there are a large number of questions about Vera's talk, and I certainly don't want to monopolize in any way. Sorry, the application is just going a bit strange. So a large number of variants of this question have been asked. Should package errors be part of the standard library? I think the answer for that is I worked hard to keep it a very small API because I knew that a very large API would have no chance of being included in the standard library. It's certainly my intention to propose something like this for the 1.8 cycle using our proposal process. And really, what you saw in the slides and what you saw in the repo is a proof of concept, because after going through the proposal process a few times, code speaks louder than words. So it's definitely my intention, but I can't really tell you if or what it would look like if it were merged into the standard library. Okay. Daniel, what about all those libraries in Python? Don't you find Go is lacking in that regard? So,
The million-dollar question. I think there's two parts to this. The first part I would say is that just because there are a large number of packages in the Python data science community, it hasn't really solved the problems that I discussed in my talk. It doesn't really prevent data scientists from hitting that wall where they have trouble with reproducibility, they have trouble with deployment. And no matter how cool the packages are, if you're not able to actually utilize what you're building in your company, then at that point the packages don't really matter. But the second part, I would say, is a more direct answer to the question, I guess. I haven't found it, for me personally, to be a big problem, and I think this is something Wisdom and I were talking about before coming up here. And the fact is that as a data scientist, even though a lot of people talk about the machine learning part of it, data scientists spend almost all their time moving data, cleaning data, organizing it, parsing it, and getting ready to do something. And that's probably 90% of the time. And then there's that 5 to 10% that's maybe modeling or machine learning and that sort of thing. So I think for me, Go has provided enough functionality in that last little respect to keep me happy, but also a really great, there's really great functionality in terms of that other 90% of my time that's already available. And then, like with things like the TensorFlow API and such coming, there's really no end to what we can do. So.
Okay, I have a question which is not directed to anyone in particular, so you can all speculate on it. What major changes should we expect in Go 2.0?
Generics.
I'm glad we got that out of the way. Okay, there are...
It's too easy. That's it.
Alan, there are a number of people who are concerned that IntelliJ was not featured highly enough on your list of IDE integrations.
I don't actually use IntelliJ. I haven't used it. I don't know what the status is of the integration. If somebody's really passionate about IntelliJ, I can work with them to add support for Guru to it. I'm afraid I don't know.
So it needs an IntelliJ expert or someone who's passionate about that too.
I heard once somebody was looking into it. I just don't know what came of that.
Okay. Here's also one for the table. Where do you get the blue gopher on the table? Especially this one. Maybe you can tell the story of this one over here.
This one, actually, this gopher is made in Ukraine. There's a company that makes like toys for IT people. And yeah, I'm not sure if they have international delivery right now, but I would be happy to like start this process, maybe to help, because many people saw the photos and they asked where to buy it and how to get it. So yeah, we can talk.
Okay, Francesc. Is there a way to test if a concrete type within an interface is nil? If so, is there a way of doing it without knowing the concrete type?
I'm having issues listening to you, so I'm going to read.
the answer is not never.
Is there a way to tell if a concrete type?
Shall I repeat the question?
What is the question again?
Is there a way to tell if a concrete type is nil within an interface?
Not without reflection, I think.
No. I mean, if you know the concrete type and you do a casting, like basically the type conversion, not a type conversion, a type assertion, then you can check, is this the type I think it is, and then check if it is nil or not. Otherwise, no. Well, or reflection.
Okay. Daniel, we have a question. What is the advantage of that version file system, Pachyderm, over using something like just using Git? Can you talk about the advantages of using Pachyderm versus Git?
Sure, yeah. So for one, I mean, I guess Git has the large file storage thing now, but in a standard repository, there are limits on the size of your files, so that's one thing. But the part of Pachyderm, which I touched a lot on the data versioning part, but there's that other part that is the pipelining part, takes advantage of the versioning in a very unique way. So you can build containerized pipelines. So each stage of your pipeline is defined by a Docker container. It could be Go or Python or whatever. And then as your pipeline executes, it automatically versions your data coming out of one container into another. So that if you have some complicated pipeline, let's say you have 21 stages, you're versioning the data coming into and out of each of those stages. So like if the 15th stage fails, you already have the commit of the previous stage and you can just restart instead of running that, the whole thing over again. Or if you want to completely reproduce an experiment, you have a snapshot of what came into and out of each stage of data analysis, plus having the Docker images that were utilized in that pipeline. So in essence, making the entire experiment reproducible exactly.
Okay. There's one I think I'll answer, which is, how does the error stack work with a deferred error? I tend to like to use defer reader.close and ignore errors from close. So we always capture the program counter at the point where you call errors.new or errors.wrap. So if you call that in defer, it will be the line that the defer is on. Now, there are two ways you could look at that. One, you could say, well, actually, the other thing happened down here, but the error is being registered as happening here. Or the other one you could say is, that's actually where the call to errors.new happened. So depending on your point of view, you could say, well, it only gets me down to the function, it doesn't get me down to the actual line. Or you could say, well, actually, maybe that's correct. That's about the most comprehensive answer I can give. And for the 17 people that upticked it, I'll talk to you about it later. Okay. So, Wisdom, there are a number of questions about how do you deal with source control in the context of versioning.
What specifically is the question?
That is the question.
Okay. Well, the way I think about this is you're working on a project, you have a bunch of dependencies you need for your project, and so you use perhaps one of these tools like Glide or GB, you get those dependencies downloaded into your repository. Now within your repository you have a very clearly defined version for each of those dependencies that your project relies on, and assuming you're using some kind of version control like Git or Subversion, each time you make changes, you commit it to your repository, it gives you a record not just of the version of your package, but also a version for those dependencies implicitly. Now, if you perhaps made additional changes, added some features, fixed some bugs, and then you want to bump to, say, like a 2.0 version, in those cases, you still make changes to your application, but if for whatever reason you need some more recent version of your dependency, you can then go and re-vendor that package, right? You can go get it again or pin it to a specific version that perhaps changes an API or whatever. Now, implicit in the fact that it's within your vendor folder and also checked into your repository, you have your version control of those dependencies implicitly. And this, I guess, goes back to the first suggestion to always vendor your dependencies. That way, things just work, and you don't need to think too much about versioning.
So, Ivan, we have a question about visualization. Has having a great visualization tool helped you uncovered any bugs in practice?
Well, yeah, I actually have even slide prepared for that and how to use this tool for debug some subtle concurrency issues. But right now, I removed it because I didn't want to give people incentive to use this tool like for real debugging, because right now on the real traces, on the big traces, the browser just will hang up. But yeah, in the future, I think that will be the way to look into some real traces from real servers. And by the way, right now, to read the trace, you need the trace file and the binary. But in Go.7, there will be enough just to download the trace file. So and overhead will be much lower than right now. And you will be able to go to the real server, to the endpoint, get the trace, for example, for last 10 seconds, and then analyze this trace. So yeah, there is some kind of bugs that can be seen with this trace. Actually, there was an article about causal profiling like a few months ago. It was describing some concurrency problem, and approach of causal profiling, how to debug this. So I used the same problem, the same code, and visually you can literally see that your Go routines that intended to be using CPU, they all in blocked state. Yeah, so maybe I will update in some blog post on this. So yeah.
Thank you. So I have a question for Frances from the audience. Where can we, it's very popular, where can we get your t-shirt?
It is online. I will tweet about it. I don't know the address. It's somewhere all shirt or something. Yeah. Yeah, I don't get any money from them, by the way, just in case.
So this is a question for all of you. What is your preferred Go package for application logging? Maybe it's 0 for logging?
For logging?
Yes. Do you use the built-in log package, GoKit, Logrus, etc., and why? So does anyone have an opinion on their favorite logging package? And would you be prepared to defend it in a knife fight against the others?
I prefer using standard log unless you have really reason to use some, for example, structured logging or something more complex. And if you need the leveling, it's easy to implement using the just writer interface and setting the log set output.
Anybody else have an opinion on logging?
I use the standard log package when I'm developing external tools, but in Google we have our own log package, which is a similar API but fits into our existing logging infrastructure. So that's my second favorite.
At MongoDB, we have an internal logging package we use as well that has things like the levels and stuff like that. I don't really have a favorite. I think it depends on what you're trying to do, right? Like the standard log package does a lot, and it's sufficient for most cases. But I don't feel too strongly about what log package people should use. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much like him, but instead of the internal one, I use things for like App Engine and stuff like that, which is pretty much the same thing. So.
Right.
But in general, standard library is good enough.
So Alan, the Guru is developed, it doesn't have any releases. Is there a plan to freeze the API at some point and declare a 1.0 version of the Guru?
I have not any such plans. I have become increasingly conscious that breaking changes are a nuisance for people, and I will try to keep them to a minimum. The name change from Oracle was actually an opportunity to make a raft of small breaking changes, and so I hope to keep the command line interface very stable from now on. The libraries beneath Guru, there's a lot of things in the tools repository. Those have been evolving, not strictly keeping compatibility, but I'm trying to keep the number of breaking changes there to an absolute minimum.
Okay, again, on the subject of repository management in vendoring, have any of you had an experience with using Git submodules versus cloning the data into that? Someone?
I haven't, no.
I just know that you're not supposed to do Git submodules. That's pretty much it.
That's what I've been told.
Okay. So Alan, you mentioned that you would trade completeness for speed in a future version of the Guru. Do you have any specific cases in mind where such a trade-off would apply?
So if you had saved a change in a low-level package and the tool was catching up by recomputing the ramifications of that change, it might take 10 or 15 seconds to get through a large workspace. And if in the meantime you make a query that is affected by that change, you might get results that are a minute old. I suspect it probably wouldn't be much more than on the scale of a minute or two, even for a large workspace. But probably you would be aware of the kinds of things you just changed, and you might in the back of your mind know that something might not be quite up to date. So I think for a tool where correctness is not 100% critical, I think this kind of compromise is likely to be acceptable.
Thank you. So Daniel, what are some of the advantages of modeling neural networks like TensorFlow? What are the advantages of using Go for that in modeling neural networks?
In modeling networks? What was it?
So what are some of the advantages of modeling neural networks, especially TensorFlow, in Go?
So is the question related to modeling? So what's
Modeling neural networks.
oh, modeling neural networks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I read it.
Thank you. So I think, I mean, once we have this connector to TensorFlow, I think using that connection will be a great way to train your neural networks, because TensorFlow has proven to be very, very useful. There's other neural network packages implemented in Go, although I can't really speak to those as I don't have experience with them. But I think, again, you know, having the ability to work in Go and have some confidence about what you're deploying and around reproducibility, and then also, you know, if you want to do neural networks, making that connection to TensorFlow or using one of those other packages, I think is the biggest benefit. Not so much that you can't do neural networks in Python or R or whatever language, but I think the advantages are not so much in the neural networks themselves, but in your workflow and in what you're able to produce, you know, after you're done building your application.
Thank you. So this is a question probably for Francesc and Alan. For Go 1.8, assuming we're not going to have generics, what are some of the other features that people could expect? What can you tell us about what's planned for Go 1.8? Can you tell us anything?
What's planned? So one of the things I would like to see, just for the tools I work on, is a better APIs for using the Go types package, which is in the standard library since 1.6. It's a little hard right now. If you use the Go types package to do your own kinds of tools, you'll find that it sort of nudges you towards reading compiler.a files, which are often very stale, and so it's actually hard to use it in the right way, and the defaults don't get you there. So I'd like to make it easier to build tools that use Go types for ordinary people.
For me, more than the features, I think it's just more speed in many places. I think that once we get the SSA backend working, we're going to have better programs in general, smaller. And also, I'm looking forward to see if we're able to lower the garbage collector pauses again by the same factor. That'd be pretty amazing.
Okay, this is a question really for the whole panel. This is from someone saying, coming from a Java background, I feel like organizing code in Go is challenging. What do you recommend regarding the organization, or how do you structure your code?
Forget Java.
Okay.
I come from a Java background as well, and it's weird, but I think this is going to sound maybe strange to some of you, but just read the manual. You know, it actually very clearly explains how to best go about structuring your programs. It's pretty straightforward. Typically, you have your Go path and then a sus src directory underneath that, and then your project. Of course, when it comes to things like vendoring, it might get a little bit complicated. And hopefully, with the talk today, that is kind of less of a black box. But I think the standard library, I think it's called Intro to Go. I forgot the name of the document, but they do a pretty good job of explaining just how to go about structuring your programs. And I think for the most part, most people do it the same way as is recommended by the Go team. So yeah, I would just recommend following that example. And as I said, like, I'm really keen on everyone following the same standard because it makes our life sane. I'm working on a project now that deals with like SQL and MongoDB's query language, and it's a nightmare to deal with because we just have different standards. And so I'm pretty passionate about having a single standard. And so it's the same with vendoring. I think it's helpful for everyone to structure their packages in the way the documentation recommends. And I think just like GoFont, it makes everyone comfortable entering a new code base and understanding what's there.
Anybody else have any?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with him. Basically, try to start as simple as possible. I know that many people feel the need to have multiple code paths and like complicated settings. Just start with the most simplest thing that you can do. My go path is just my home. That's it. And I start from there. And once you start having more requirements and more things that you need to do, then start looking at other tools. But really just follow the guides and be open to a different way of doing things. Because if you just expect Go to organize the code just as in Java, you're going to be disappointed.
So I wasn't sure if the question was asking about project directory organization or about interfaces and packages and so on. But one of
I think you could interpret it in either way.
Okay, so one of the things we do at Google is readability review, which is a process where people who've been programming in Go for some time review pretty much every line of Go code written by novices. And so we see a lot of the kind of common mistakes that people bring. And one of them, I would say, the biggest one is just preemptive abstraction, creating interfaces all over the place when you don't really need them, or just putting too many things in your API. And so I feel like we push back a lot against just too many interfaces that need to be maintained for a long time. Just trying to, even if that means longer functions sometimes, that's fine, so long as you're exposing fewer things that you then have to support for a long time.
Just to finally add to what they've said, I was having lunch with a bunch of developers, and we were talking about an issue related to this, and one thing we kind of kept harping on was the idea of modularization, right, which we all know. I think there are certain times where a lot of us might have a tendency to kind of just conflate and like put everything in one package. And so I think if your application lends itself to modularization, so like perhaps different packages, it's something to consider because it helps make the entire top-level program easier to understand, and it, in some cases, helps with reusability. So just something to keep in mind. You don't necessarily have to put everything in one place. If it makes sense, create a new library and use that instead.
Okay, again, wisdom. Go vendor flattens to allow multiple dependencies which vendor the same package to communicate. I believe the question is asking about, in your slides you showed you could end up in a situation with multiple copies of Go context.
Yeah.
What do you think about the ideas of flattening that dependency hierarchy?
So this is a really contentious issue, right? The typical example is I've got multiple versions of the same package that are used by different dependencies within my project. So how exactly do I handle that? In the general case, assuming those libraries use this vendoring feature, they'd have their own specific dependencies in your repo. There are tools, as I mentioned, like Glide, that help you kind of put all of that on the same level. I haven't really looked deeply into how exactly it works. I understand there are situations where it's not, advisable to do that, but I think as a community we need to, keep talking about this and try and figure out best ways to handle this, because there are legitimate reasons why you'd have different versions of the same package in your project, right? But we know Go doesn't give you a way to specify the version within your import path that you'd want to use for a particular program. I think, Dave, you can contribute to this because you've worked quite a bit in this space as well. So what do you think?
So if you see the things I post on the mailing list, I keep banging on this mantra of there should be only one copy of the code in your final binary. And I see the difficulties that happen when vendoring is piled upon vendoring, piled upon vendoring, as the direct reaction of not doing this. You have type equality doesn't match anymore, and you have multiple things. So from my point of view, and if you look at the way that GB is structured, there is only one copy of every package. It's either in your source code or in your vendor source code. There's no notion of multiple levels of hierarchy in that. Personally, I think that's the only way to sensibly think about it, because of the way of Go's static linking model. There can only be one copy of the package in your final binary, so there should only be one copy of the source that you start from. I have a question for Francesc. Why is nil not a keyword?
Because it doesn't need to. I think that Go tries to be as simple as possible, and keywords, the only thing that they afford is their reserved words, which might make parsing that code easier. But at the end of the day, if you want to call a function nil and you have a good reason enough, why shouldn't that be possible?
That's true. As a follow-up, this is not a question.
You need to have a good reason enough, though.
What would happen if nil was a keyword?
I don't think that anyone really declares nil, so I hope nothing.
It's sometimes useful to declare methods with names like int and string when they're methods that do some operation on ints or strings, because they don't actually get in the way. You have to always access them with a dot in front.
And a follow-up, what are the 5 secret Go keywords?
Oh. So if I remember correctly, they are right after a comment with a poo emoji somewhere in the source code. And there is the truth of the matter. What else? The truth of the matter, insofar as I don't remember now.
We should
Not
use mirror to
notwithstanding.
find it out. Like,
Yeah, if you search for the poo emoji on the Go repo, there's only one. So that should be easy.
The truth of the matter is it's a bug.
The truth of the matter is
the truth of the matter is it's a bug in GC.
So there's a question for me, which is, what would you say to people who are reluctant to add and import like package errors as an idiom or a required dependency? Is it simply a natural course of aging of the language, or should the standard library be handling errors better? I think I've addressed the second part of that question before. I don't think I could ever claim that this should be a required dependency that people should use. The code that I write it for myself. I hope it will be useful for other people. If you pick it up and you use it, that's fabulous. If you have different ideas and different interpretations of how you think Go should be written, then all power to you. I notice that I tend to, when I present ideas, they tend to be a little bit contrarian or off the track. That doesn't mean that I'm right. I just like thinking about the problem and coming up with different solutions.
I think there's a lot of interest in augmented errors because people are often reinventing the ability to get stack information out of their programs, and I think the time is right for some kind of proposal to unify these efforts.
So I think the easiest answer is there seems to be a little bit of interest in seeing this as a proposal for Go 1.8, and we'll look at what happens then. Okay. A very highly rated question. What do you think is Go's left pad? I think this might be a little bit unfair, but...
Go's left pad? What does that mean? It's the
bug, right?
Yeah.
Gorilla Max? No.
Do you think that's a fair thing to say about Go?
I mean, the biggest problem with leftpad was the lack of vendoring, so you could break so many different packages by removing one little thing that was shared by all of us. Well, all of them. That could not happen with vendoring, so no.
Yeah, well, it was super multi-dimensional problem.
Yeah,
There was
it's
many things
cultural
involved. And as
yeah.
I remember, there was, even if you use vendoring, okay, if you use versioning, not vendoring, yeah, you still have a problem. But actually, I even wrote the program in Go that calls depth check. It was inspired by leftpad. What it does, it analyzes your Go program and looks for very small dependencies, like leftpad-like dependencies, and suggest you just to take a look. Maybe this is super small dependency, and you can just copy it into your code. So this is one of the problems with leftpad, that people often don't understand that dependency also has some costs. In Go, it's very small cost, but still you have to deal with this dependency in the future.
It reminds me of Dave's tweet on dependencies are like puppies. I don't know exactly what it was that you said. It was you, right?
Something like a dependency is like a puppy, like it's not just for Christmas or something.
Yeah. Once you get it, you need to feed it.
Yeah. It's good.
So, Alan, there are many internal Google tools, especially for static analysis. I don't know what this person knows, which are not yet open source. So maybe I shouldn't even be asking this question. Are there any powerful tools at Google that you would like to open source?
I think the issue with Google is we have great internal tools, but it's not easy to open source them because they're all part of this kind of connected ecosystem where each one depends on each other. And so I noticed that they're open sourcing the build tool, Blaze, at the moment. But it's a lot of the other things that we depend on are quite sort of coupled to each other. I think a lot of the code review tools internally at Google have led to external initiatives to build good code review. And so the things have gotten a lot better in the last few years. In terms of specific static analysis tools, many of them actually come externally, start externally, and then come into Google. So we use GoLint and GoVet. We use all the dynamic analysis tools that Dmitry Vyukov has built. These things are actually external code bases that we brought in-house. I don't think there's, for specific Go static analysis, I don't think there's much secret source that we haven't shared with the world.
Okay, we have just under 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask some general questions for all of you. You can jump in. How do you feel about having a monorepo? Have you heard do you think a monorepo is a good pattern to emulate for general developers, or do you think it's a Google-specific optimization? Has anyone worked and tried to do a monorepo at your work?
We discussed in the company. We don't use monorepo, but we discussed. But for me, it's like very dependent on the structure of the company, on how many people and how it works with code, the size of the code, the size of the code base, the frequency on how you update and how you deal. So if it's easy, for example, speaking about these vendoring problems with context, for example, vendor it multiple times. If it's easy just to go directly to the person and ask him to update this dependency in his project, so there is no problem. But if it's open source or internet community that you can just probably so easily talk to other people and ask them to fix something. So yeah, I mean, monorepo is kind of good, but it depends on who and how works on the code.
So actually, this question just made me think of an answer to the last one, which is I believe monorepos are probably Go's left pad, right? So what happens if someone changes an API? If it's a monorepo, who knows how many applications internally break because of that? Now, I don't know how things exactly work at Google if that's an issue. I heard there are certain initiatives to kind of move away from the monorepo internally to have more modular type pieces of software. I personally am a big advocate for modularity. I think it helps manage things better, and if, as I mentioned, something changes, you're kind of in a way protected from those changes breaking your applications essentially. I believe there are certain cases where it's important, but my preference would be not to do that. I'd rather have each different application live in its own separate repo, and when you need to, you kind of compose them instead of just having this huge repository that contains everything.
So when in Google's monorepo, if somebody upgrades a single third-party package, that it's their responsibility to make sure that the whole of the rest of the tree continues to build. And it can be a lot of work sometimes, but it does have this advantage. There's always only one copy at any time. But it's a huge commons, and it requires some full-time gardeners who just keep things running. It's a lot of work, but it does have benefits.
I wish Google open sourced the Piper so more people could try it. Because most people I talk to, they tried monorepo approach, they use Git, and they like struggling with technical issues with Git. So maybe, I don't know about details about Piper, but maybe.
Yeah. I have a friend who works at Facebook, and we're talking about this. His full-time job essentially is they, I think, hack, what's it called, Subversion, one of these BCS, but his full-time job essentially is to make sure these VCSs are able to keep up with just the huge amounts of like traffic they get in their VCS, you know. So as I think Alan mentioned, you know, it creates a significant burden on your employees to maintain compatibility with the API, and you know, furthermore, like people like my friend who has to ensure that the underlying algorithms that support the version control systems are able to keep up with just the huge amount of changes that come in on a daily basis.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left, so we'll make this the last question for all of you. If you had to pick one feature, thing, or part of Go as your favorite, what would it be?
Definitely interfaces for me.
Okay.
The fact that it was written more recently than all the other languages we use and has used a lot of opportunities to simplify.
Neil?
Well,
Daniel?
probably coming from Python, static typing.
Right?
And I was captured by Go concurrency isness initially, so yeah, probably the Go keyword.
Okay. Well, Alan, Go rename. Can it ignore files with syntax errors so I can get on with my refactoring?
I think it cannot today. That's a shame. It should.
This is related to what you were talking about earlier with keeping editing in a buffer. The pointer analysis needs your entire source to be compilable.
It needs analogous support for things like that. I think it should be able to support that. It's just more work, and I haven't done it yet.
Again, for the whole group, anyone to jump in? How important is it in Go to reduce coupling between packages? It sounded like this was a big focus for not exporting error types. So do you have any views on this idea of coupling and cohesion as it relates to Go?
For me, the most important thing is that coupling makes testing hard. And testing is important.
Yes.
So for me, that is the main thing. Coupling by itself is not that negative, but if coupling stops you from testing your code, then you do have an issue.
I'm a bit confused by what exactly the questioner meant by coupling packages. Because I think for the most part, it's inevitable, right? You import packages to build your program.
But interfaces can break dependencies.
Right, so those aren't like packages, they're like constructs in packages, right? Like an interface or an exported function. But I think coupling packages is inevitable, right? That's how we program. We don't write the entire stack and every dependency we need. But yeah, like if you, as I mentioned earlier, have good reason to break things out in terms of different repositories, I think it's always better to do that than to have like a monolithic program that has a bunch of different features just kind of juxtaposed and conflated within a single package. But with regards to coupling packages, at least if it's how I understand it correctly, it's inevitable, right? Like we all depend on other people's work to produce new stuff.
Okay, probably one for the Googlers in the room. Are there any plans for GoGet to support Git tags or some other method to have package versions?
Not that I know of, but there may be. It's not a tool I maintain.
That was easy.
No idea.
So we are at our time limit. There are so many questions that we unfortunately did not have time to get to. What's going to happen now is that we have all the questions archived, and I'm going to encourage the speakers to try and answer as many of them in whatever form they choose. They might write it up as a blog post, they might tweet it, they might tweet it, but we'll try and in some way answer all your questions. So thank you very much for coming along and trying this experiment. A big round of applause again for all our speakers.